Our next presentation this morning will be from Professor Catherine Lovelock from the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Queensland.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about blue carbon today. So I'm talking about blue carbon in coastal wetlands, and I'm really talking about today salt marshes, seagrasses and mangroves. And I mean, these are really amazing plant communities. They're essentially terrestrial plants that have reinvaded the sea or invaded the sea on the edges. So they bring with them, this amazing tolerance of salt and inundation, so they can tolerate, being underwater in the case of seagrasses, but also periodically submerged for roots and salt marsh plants. So they bring with them the compounds of terrestrial environments, lignin, cellulose, into the marine environment where the fungi that decompose terrestrial plants don't follow them. So this leads to, in addition to these very anoxic kind of inundated soils, this leads to the accumulation of carbon within the soils of these systems, as well as the above ground biomass in mangroves, which can be also substantial. So this capacity to be highly productive and produce compounds that don't decompose readily, that are contributed to the soils, which accrete over time. So all of these systems basically increase their soil volume over time, and that there's evidence of 10 metres of accumulation of mangrove peat, for example, in the Caribbean, or 5 metres of seagrass peat in the Mediterranean. So these have grown over time, and as sea level rise progresses, will continue to accrete. So what's been recognised is that, of course, these are now like really large stores of carbon in the coastal zone. So in addition to this, big carbon store that they have in these ecosystems, they provide a whole raft of other ecosystem services. People are concentrated on the coasts and they really depend on these ecosystems. So this is the example from mangroves. It's a report that came out 2016 from the UNEP that really spoke to the wide range of ecosystem services that mangroves and salt marshes and seagrasses provide. So one of the big ones I want to point out, of course, is fisheries, and this sort of speaks to the Sustainable Development Goal of no hunger. So in many places in the world, fisheries are directly linked, linearly linked with the area of coastal wetlands that are available. And in Queensland, for example, 70% of our commercial fish species are associated with a coastal wetland at least some part of their life cycle. Right, so food is an important contributor. Timber and forest products in places where people are intimately dependent on forests, climate regulation, of course, through carbon sequestration. But then this other piece that's all about that kind of increasing soil volume, the capacity to buffer against wave energy during tropical storms. So coastal protection is a really big part of these, the services that these systems provide. So we talk about carbon a lot, but really we are talking about climate change adaptation, and we're talking about meeting those sustainable development goals as well. So despite the fact that these ecosystems provide these amazing sort of array of systems, they've been really degraded, and these are some of my top titles, my go-to papers for that sort of stuff. So mangrove forests, probably 30 to 50% of cover has been removed, largely to conversion to shrimp aquaculture. There's accelerating loss of seagrass across the globe, and that is largely due to reductions in water quality associated with poor catchment management and nutrient additions to the coastal zone. And then, of course, the salt marshes are very poorly mapped and have been degraded for centuries. In fact, the Romans gave this a good smash, a long time ago, right? So, but it continues on. For example, we've just completed an assessment of the trajectory for salt marshes in southeast Queensland. and 50% of that habitat's been lost since the 1950s, right? Mainly due to conversion to residential, urban, and industrial developments. So they've been highly degraded. So because of this mix of things, there's a, imperative to try and conserve and restore these ecosystems. They have very high carbon stocks. They are really, really important for coasts. So this sort of mix has given rise to this concept called blue carbon. So blue carbon, it describes that, high carbon stock in the soil and high rates of sequestration. And it kind of builds off the red plus kind of, which is the reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. So it sort of builds on that idea that basically we could provide resources or incentives for restoring and conserving these ecosystems by pointing to their importance in the global carbon cycle and in carbon sequestration, right? So we're basically, by invoking the idea of blue carbon, trying to incentivise conservation and restoration of these ecosystems. And I must say here that, blue carbon is actually, a name that's given to all of the carbon in the marine environment, right? But we focus on these three ecosystems because the evidence of long-term storage is so strong, but also because these can be managed in a way that's sort of, similar to the way land can be managed. And in fact, there is guidance in the IPCC to account for greenhouse gas emissions associated with these coastal wetlands. Okay, so this, package together has made this concept extremely interesting to a range of players, and there's been global enthusiasm, and this is, the president of Indonesia speaking in 2014 at the UN, talking about his country's interest in blue carbon, and Indonesia, of course, has the largest cover of mangroves on the planet. Australia has been really enthusiastic about the concept, and in fact, they started the International Partnership for Blue Carbon, which acts like an international forum for countries that are interested in pursuing blue carbon. So this, was 2016, this was launched by the Minister. And then in Queensland, they're also very interested in blue carbon, and this is something that's very new, the Land Restoration Fund, Queensland's $500 million investment in trying to restore landscapes. And they are interested in sequestering carbon in land and soil. They want to enhance wetlands, and they want to restore ecosystems. And blue carbon is definitely a part of that mix, particularly about fisheries and hatcheries and commercial fishing and those kinds of concepts. So there's lots of room in Australia to incorporate blue carbon. So in addition to that, we've had one of the globally an investment. One of the few sort of like national attempts to do some research on blue carbon. This was a CSIRO cluster project where we were able, at least in the work package, we had work package 1, which was tasked with accumulating the data on carbon stocks and sequestration rates across Australia. So, we did some global analyses, but we also compile the data to produce some bioregional carbon stocks and sequestration rates for those three ecosystems across Australia. So we have quite a good sort of scientific underpinning. So that's my introductory comments, and now I want to try and speak a little bit to what people are interested in here, which is really what is the opportunity and the volume that we might be talking about. So this is my sort of like way I think about this. We have intact systems that are net greenhouse gas sinks, right? So they are absorbing CO2. And it was pointed out yesterday that there was some methane emissions when you have very low salinity systems, but in general they're a net sink. When you degrade or convert these things, you lead to CO2 emissions, which conservation is really trying to prevent. But, that can also encompass, just degradation and also alterations to another ecosystem. And then finally, we have net greenhouse gas emissions from the degraded state. Depending on the land use of what it's been converted to, you might have quite substantial methane emissions if it's impounded and turned to fresh, or nitrous oxide emissions if you're fertilising, for example, cane land or rice. Finally, you can undertake restoration projects. This is what I really am going to focus on here because it's most relevant to Australia, where we can resume CO2 sequestration, but we can also avoid the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the alternative land use. So in this picture, we've got an intact mangrove, and then we've got aquaculture ponds as the alternative land use in that case. Okay, so firstly, I wanted to speak to that carbon sink. So this is a diagram from a paper that was published a couple of weeks ago by my colleagues from National University of Singapore. And they accumulated the, carbon sequestration rate, surface areas, and global carbon sequestration you could attribute to that ecosystem for a range of ecosystems, right? So what they, found by doing this analysis, and it's great that we keep doing this analysis as the data gets richer and richer, right? And what we can see here is that the per hectare sequestration rate, of course, is much higher in mangroves and seagrasses and salt marsh. This because of that anoxia, this capacity to accumulate soil volume, right? But basically, if you look at the next panel, you see that the area compared to, say, for example, the tropical forests to the far left of the screen, they, of course, have much larger area, and we're only talking, very, very small proportions of the surface area of the land, right? And then finally, if you look at the global sequestration rate, you can see that together these ecosystems basically only contribute 1% to 2% of global sequestration in the land sector, right? Which is quite small. However, an analysis like that at a global level really doesn't speak to these national concerns, and most people account for their greenhouse gas emissions associated at a national level or subnational. So this hides the fact that for Papua New Guinea, actually mangroves are a hugely important sink on the landscape, or for Belize, or Bangladesh, or Cuba, where these ecosystems actually are a large proportion of their landscape. The other thing that it doesn't really do is that in greenhouse gas accounting, we sort of assume that these natural ecosystems are pretty much in steady state, right? And what we're interested in is the change. We're interested in conversion and we're interested in restoration to see what we can do about changing the emissions. Okay, so I want to then speak to the importance of these losses and also restoration that could be, have been, discussed. So the global estimate of the CO2 emissions associated with the degradation of blue carbon systems is about a petagram, somewhere between 0.1 and 1 petagram, estimated by Linwood Pendleton and colleagues in 2012. So for Indonesia, published more recently, Daniel Modiaso from C4, who sits in Indonesia, and he looked and estimated that if they stopped that conversion to aquaculture in Indonesia, they could basically reduce their land use emissions, by somewhere between 10 and 30%, right? So this is a substantial portion of their land use sector emissions. And on the bottom here, you can see that increase in shrimp aquaculture over time in the Asian nations, and then the estimated emissions associated with those conversions, all right? So that's an important point, why these systems are important for many nations. So the other thing, that's sort of talking about CO2, but actually methane emissions and nitrous oxide is something that I have a growing interest in. So methane emissions are much higher under freshwater conditions than they are under saline conditions, right? So the reintroduction of salt water into systems that have been impounded from and where tidal inundation is prevented, actually provides quite an opportunity. And you can see here on the bottom this picture of a ponded pasture. So this is a common land use throughout Eastern Australia, and also it's a common land use in the United States. Basically, you put up a low earthen bund or levee, and you prevent tidal inundation, and that makes the land behind, as you have seasonal rainfall, become fresh, where you can grow cattle pasture. So these are land uses that are, have been, people don't even think about it anymore, because a lot of these conversions were done in the 60s, prior to a lot of attention. But in Queensland, there's definitely 30,000, maybe 50,000 hectares or more of this particular land use. And it's used for cattle production, but it's also, there's a lot of issues with weeds in these systems. So probably one of the other things that's interesting is nitrous oxide, and in many parts of the wet tropics, for example, salt marsh and melaleuca has been converted to sugarcane. So there's rarely a mangrove you don't step off a sugarcane paddock and into the mangrove, right? So there's a lot of emissions associated with those that if saltwater incursion was facilitated by removing bund walls, we could have quite some gains. So the IPCC gives some guidance for a default emission factor for reintroduction of tidal waters into freshwater systems of about 5 megagram CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. So these processes are outlined in this diagram that come from a paper that was published in 2017 by Kevin Kroger et al. From the United States, where they sort of looked at how salt marsh restoration from impounded systems, that's the diagram on the bottom, can basically reduce methane emissions, restart carbon sequestration, and have an impact on the carbon balance of these converted systems. Okay, so this is an example based on some work that the Carbon Cluster, our CSIRO project, did for the Emission Reduction Fund scoping exercise for blue carbon methodology. And we explored a range of sort of scenarios. So some of these, I've listed 5 that you might find interesting. We have drained land, so something where the tide's been prevented and it's been drained, which means there's CO2 emissions from the soils, restored back to mangroves, and we might get some kind of abatement that is around 50 megagrams per hectare per year, right down to if you have flooded land, so those ponded pastures, and you restore them to salt marsh, so you avoid the methane emission and you kickstart the soil carbon sequestration again. And then finally, I've got one that's conversion to mangrove if you plan for sea level rise, which also is an opportunity for us on our very broad and gently sloping coastal plains. Okay, so the opportunities. Now, actually the emission factors and removals are sort of easy data to come by compared to trying to understand what the opportunity is. So basically, globally, it's not well characterised. So, because mapping areas that used to be salt marsh is quite a salt marsh or seagrass is a difficult endeavour. But if you do a back of the envelope calculation, you might expect that globally we could, around 0.1 petagram a year if we restored, say, 25% of the lost wetland area. In Australia, I wanted to we've got a lot of opportunity, and I've done the calculations here in the next slide for degraded and converted salt marsh in Queensland and New South Wales, which might reach about 100,000 hectares of possibility. This, of course, requires all sorts of social buy-in to this process, which is difficult. And you can see this sort of, this bottom picture is basically showing, how these salt marshes have been converted. This one's not impounded, but has been filled. So if we do this one scenario and we restore 100,000 hectares of coastal wetlands, we've got an abatement of about 3 teragrams, and that might be, or somewhere up to that, I suppose. I'm trying to be conservative, somewhere to, like 8 to 39% of Australia's land sector emissions, which is currently a sink. We could add to that sink. But if we look at it in terms of the energy or total emissions, then of course it's a much smaller proportion for us. But I would argue still extremely important, particularly given the co-benefits of fisheries, coastal protection and climate change adaptation. So, just final 1 minute, I wanted to talk about just briefly the progress in the methods. The 2013 Wetlands Supplement provides emissions and removals factors, emission factors basically for both degradation and restoration of coastal wetlands, a great step which Australia is committed to adopting. And I'm involved in the 2019 revision of the guidelines for wetlands, and there's some other pieces in there that are going to add to the, I think, incentives for restoration. There are also coastal wetland methodologies available in some of the other carbon markets in the world. The Verified Carbon Standard has a method. The American Carbon Registry has a method that's particular to Louisiana. And the Emission Reduction Fund has scoped blue carbon methodology, and we'll be hearing about what they're up to next. Okay, so challenges. Identifying opportunities is a really big challenge, and one we really need to spend some time and money on. We need to do some case studies, and there are some in the works. You know, there's some planning for blue carbon case studies, at least in Australia. There are some international programs that are already off and running and financed. In Africa is probably the poster project. We need to work out where we can gain most from blue carbon projects, where alternative incomes are low, so opportunity costs are low. There's high benefits for water quality and biodiversity and adaptation to climate change. And we need to develop methodologies that are robust and cost-effective, most importantly. So, my acknowledgements, and that's it. Thank you.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask if you could touch a little bit on the methodologies from a scientific perspective of success rates of restoration. So I don't know much about mangroves and sandfire, but I had thought that with seagrass we haven't actually had a lot of success yet in terms of scientific methods for restoring seagrass areas. So I just wondered if you could let us know where that's up to.
Yeah, there was a very, very nice review published on seagrass restoration that had our colleagues from Western Australia as, you know, senior authors, as well as the Europeans who've spent a lot of time trying to understand how to restore seagrass meadows. So I think they, you know, like, yes, it's a growing science, you know, less than 30 years old, and people are still trying to work it out. But I think you know, there's a range of methods. They're expensive usually. Success rates are, you know, around 50%. So we do have a review of the costs and benefits of marine coastal restoration. It's in Ecological Applications, if you want to follow that. The first author is by Raktaroff, but I'm on the end. So that is a, you know, sort of talks about the costs and also the percent success rates. But currently we really, you know, we don't have the data for long-term successful restoration. But I would say in Australia, best example would have to be Albany and Oyster Harbour, where they've had quite a lot of success restoring Posidonia meadows.
Yeah, in a similar vein with the restoration of seagrass, are there any opportunities to propagate like you can with seaweed farms, with macroalgae, sort of large marine permaculture arrays? Would there be any way of actually growing mats and taking it out there, or is it just natural growth?
No, they're using clods, you know, so rammets, basically, you know, the way you replant your lawn, and also seed broadcasting. So that's a very popular technique in Virginia, for example, and they've had a lot of success in those estuaries in the United States. So they basically harvest seed from using mechanical harvesters from, you know, places that have intact meadows, and they spin it out and then they broadcast it, you know, off boats. And they do some things like put stakes out for birds so that they've got natural fertilisation occurring. But, you know, for seagrass restoration, the big issue is you've got to fix the problem that led to the loss in the first place, and that is usually water quality, and that means it's a problem on land, not in the sea, right? So that's the big expense and the difficulty with seagrasses, because you're talking about off-site activities, you know, having to be, you know, like successful. So it's, you know, mangrove restoration by contrast and salt mass restoration can occur at scale, particularly if it's hydrological restoration and you have natural kind of regeneration, which is the sort of preferred method. People do plant, but they usually do that for other reasons, usually social and providing work and media opportunities for politicians and things like that. Yeah.
Catherine, can you comment about not just the potential of the hectares for blue carbon restoration, but the connections between the land and the deep ocean? The blue carbon maybe the prime corridors for, you know, reestablishing land-ocean connectivity for larger carbon fluxes?
Well, you know, I'll speak for mangroves, but, you know, a large proportion of the carbon that is fixed by the trees actually exits in the tidal water, right? So, you know, the storage is like 10% of production or less, you know, somewhere between 4 and 5% of production is stored into the sediments. But actually, you know, 50, maybe 30 to 50% of the fixed carbon leaves as dissolved inorganic carbon or dissolved organic carbon, a lesser fraction through tidal exchange, right? So the fate of that carbon, you know, ends up on the shelf, right? But it's agreed that probably most of it gets remineralised and, you know, back out to the atmosphere, right? So, you know, there are others who think that some of that DOC is recalcitrant, but, you know, getting it off the shelf and below the thermocline is another issue.